The weight of justice and a mother's pain. Judge Melinda Carter stood before the large gilded mirror in her chambers, meticulously adjusting the folds of her black robe. Every morning, she followed the same routine, perfecting her appearance, ensuring that the world saw her as the firm, unwavering force of justice she had built her career around. At 56, she was a woman of discipline and poise, her sharp eyes and commanding presence enough to silence even the most unruly courtrooms. Yet today, as she secured the last button of her robe, an old familiar ache twisted deep in her chest. It had been 16 years, 16 long, painful years since her daughter, Ava, had vanished into the abyss of the unknown. Melinda inhaled sharply, willing the grief away. She had learned to lock it up, to compartmentalize the pain into a small box in her mind, a box she refused to open during the day. Her work demanded her full attention, and she would not allow herself to falter. But today, something felt different. She turned to her desk, where the case files for the day lay neatly stacked. Her assistant, Charles, had arranged them in order of importance. Melinda took a sip of her bitter black coffee and flipped open the first folder. Defendant, Noel Bennett, age, 22. Charge, possession of a controlled substance. Melinda frowned as she skimmed through the file. Another young woman caught in the cycle of drugs and poor decisions. Another life at the edge of destruction. Over the years, she had seen countless cases like this, and no matter how many she tried to help, it never seemed enough. Yet, as she stared at Noel's photograph, something about the young woman's deep brown eyes tugged at her. She reminded her of Ava. Melinda let out a sigh, pressing her fingers against her temple. No, stop thinking about her. Today is just another day. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, straightening herself. The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed as always. Your Honor, court starts in 15 minutes. Shall I escort you? Melinda nodded. Let's go. She followed Charles through the corridors of the courthouse, the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor a familiar comfort. As she entered the courtroom, the murmurs of lawyers and reporters dimmed to silence. She took her seat at the bench, her posture firm. The clerk stood and called the case. Case number 4892, the State versus Noel Bennett. Melinda glanced up as the defendant was escorted into the courtroom. Noel Bennett was petite, her frame almost too thin, her posture tense. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her wrists were shackled in front of her. But it wasn't her frail appearance that made Melinda's breath hitch. It was the necklace. A delicate silver chain rested around Noel's neck, the small pendant swinging gently with her movements. A tiny heart-shaped locket, adorned with intricate floral engravings. Melinda knew that necklace. She had seen it before. No, she had given it before. 16 years ago, on Ava's 12th birthday. The courtroom seemed to tilt, the voices around her fading into a muffled blur. Her fingers tightened around the gavel in her hand, but it felt like sand slipping through her grasp. Her vision blurred. The last time she had seen that locket, it had been clasped around Ava's slender neck, glinting in the sunlight as the little girl had laughed, twirling in the backyard. Her daughter. Her Ava. Then, without warning, the world spun, and Melinda felt herself falling. Gasps filled the courtroom as the judge slumped forward, her head hitting the desk before she collapsed onto the cold, unyielding floor. Chaos erupted. No, Judge Carter. Charles' voice was the last thing she heard before everything faded to black. Melinda's body trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair in the hospital room. The world still felt unsteady, the residual effects of her sudden collapse lingering in her limbs. But her mind was racing, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged animal. That necklace. It was Ava's. Her daughter, her baby girl, had worn it every single day until the day she vanished without a trace. For 16 years, Melinda had searched for answers, for any clue that might tell her what had happened to Ava. And now, out of nowhere, in the middle of a courtroom, there it was, hanging around the neck of a stranger. A young woman who should have had no connection to her child. She swung her legs over the edge of the hospital bed, ignoring the doctor's protests. "Judge Carter, you need rest." "No," she snapped, her voice hoarse but firm. "I need answers." Charles, her trusted assistant, was already reaching for her coat, knowing there was no use in stopping her. "At least let me drive you." Melinda gave a sharp nod, barely able to contain the storm of emotions inside her. The moment they arrived at the courthouse, she headed straight to the holding cells. "Judge Carter, what are you doing here?" one of the officers asked, surprised to see her. "I need to see Noel Bennett," she demanded, her voice edged with urgency. The officer hesitated, glancing at Charles as if expecting him to intervene. "She just wants to talk," Charles said, sighing. "Make it happen." After a long pause, the officer finally led her down the cold, gray hallway. The air smelled of disinfectant and stale regret. The sound of metal doors clanking echoed as they passed by cell after cell. And then, there she was. Noelle sat on the bench inside her cell, arms wrapped around herself. She looked so small, so vulnerable. But Melinda's focus was on the delicate silver chain around her neck, the heart-shaped locket resting just above the collar of her worn-out sweater. Melinda inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. "Noelle," she said, her voice softer now. Noelle glanced up, eyes wary. "What do you want?" Melinda swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I need to know about your necklace." Noelle's fingers instinctively reached for it, holding it protectively. "Why?" Melinda stepped closer, gripping the cold metal bars between them. "Because it belonged to my daughter." Silence. Noelle's expression shifted, first to confusion, then to something else, a flicker of something deep in her eyes, like a buried memory trying to surface. "What?" she whispered, shaking her head. "No. She looked down at the locket, as if seeing it for the first time. "I've had this forever." Melinda's pulse pounded. "How did you get it?" Noelle hesitated, her brows knitting together. I don't know. It's just always been mine." Melinda's breath hitched. Her hands clenched at her sides as she forced herself to ask the terrifying question forming in her mind. "Noelle," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "How old are you?" Noelle frowned at the strange question. "I just turned 22. 22. The same age Ava would have been." Melinda's stomach dropped. Her breath quickened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse all over again. Noelle shifted uncomfortably under Melinda's intense stare. "Why are you asking me this?" Melinda swallowed, trying to regain control. "Where were you born?" Noelle hesitated. I don't know." "You don't know?" Melinda's voice cracked. "I grew up in the foster system," Noelle muttered, looking away. "I don't remember much from before I was about 5. Everything before that is just blurry." The room felt too small, the air too thin. Noelle had been in the foster system. She had no memories before the age of 5. And she had Ava's necklace. Melinda's world spun. Could it be? Could this girl, this stranger, be her Ava? "Noelle," Melinda whispered, gripping the bars tighter. "I need to see that locket. Please." Noelle hesitated, her fingers tightening around it. She had never taken it off. It was the only thing she had that felt hers, that felt like a part of a past she couldn't remember. But something about Melinda's voice, the raw desperation in her eyes, made her slowly unclasp the chain. She held out the locket, passing it through the bars with trembling hands. Melinda's fingers closed around it. She knew what she was looking for. With shaking hands, she turned the locket over. And there on the back was the tiny engraving she had put there herself 16 years ago. "Forever my Ava." Melinda's breath left her in a strangled sob. Her knees buckled, and she had to grip the bars to stay standing. Noelle flinched at the sudden outburst. What's wrong?" she asked, her voice small. Tears streamed down Melinda's face as she looked up at the young woman who had lived a life she had never known, who had been lost and alone when she should have been home, safe in her mother's arms. "It's you," Melinda choked out. "Oh my God, it's you." Noelle's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Melinda pressed her palm against her mouth, struggling to breathe. "Noelle," she whispered, voice breaking. "You're my daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy with 16 years of pain, of loss, of questions finally answered. Noelle's eyes widened. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. That's not possible." Melinda let out a sob, clutching the locket to her chest. "It is," she said, her voice trembling. "I lost you 16 years ago. And now I found you." Noelle stumbled back, her heart pounding. "No, this can't be real." Tears streamed down Melinda's face as she reached a hand through the bars, desperate to touch her daughter, to hold her, to make up for every second they had lost. But Noelle took another step back. Her mind reeled. She had spent her whole life believing she had no family, no past. And now, this woman, this judge, was standing before her, telling her that everything she knew was a lie. "I need air," Noelle muttered, her hands shaking. She turned away, her heart pounding as she tried to process the impossible truth. And as she walked to the back of her cell, putting as much distance as she could between herself and Melinda, the judge stood frozen in place, gripping the necklace to her chest. 16 years of loss. 16 years of pain. But now, against all odds, she had found her daughter. The name from the past. The cold, sterile walls of the courthouse holding area seemed to close in around Judge Melinda Carter as she sat motionless on the metal chair. The hard edges of the locket dug into her palm as she clutched it tightly, her breath uneven, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. Across the small interrogation room, Noelle sat stiffly in her seat, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against the invisible force pressing down on both of them. The young woman's dark brown eyes darted to Melinda's face, uncertain and full of guarded suspicion. For years, Noelle had learned that people only cared when they wanted something. The system had taught her that. Foster homes, shelters, the cold reality of the streets. Nothing had ever felt like home. She had trained herself not to trust too easily, not to get attached. Yet here sat a woman she had only ever seen as a stern, powerful judge, now staring at her with an intensity that made Noelle's stomach twist. Melinda's fingers trembled as she traced the engraving on the back of the locket. "Forever, my Eve." This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't even a cruel trick played by fate. It was her daughter. Noelle Bennett was Eva Carter. Melinda felt tears threatening again, but she swallowed them down. She needed to stay composed. She needed Noelle to believe her. "Noelle," Melinda began, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember anything from before the foster system? Before you were placed into the homes?" Noelle flinched, her hands curled into fists, her body instinctively pulling away. "Why does it matter?" Melinda exhaled, trying to control the storm inside her. "Because I lost my daughter 16 years ago." Noelle's brows furrowed, confusion flickering over her face. "What does that have to do with me?" Melinda turned the locket around and gently slid it across the table, pushing it toward Noelle. "Because this belonged to her." Noelle's breath hitched as she hesitantly reached out, her fingers costing over the familiar ridges of the silver heart. The necklace had always been with her. She had no memory of where it came from, only that it was hers. But now, this woman was telling her it belonged to someone else. "I don't understand," Noelle murmured, shaking her head. "I've always had this." Melinda leaned forward, her pulse racing. "Do you remember anything before you were 5? Any flashes of a different life? A name? A place?" Noelle's lips parted, but no words came out. Her past before the age of 5 was a blank slate. She had tried remembering before, but nothing ever surfaced. It was like those years had been wiped from her mind, leaving her with only fragments of emotions: warmth, fear, the distant echo of laughter. And then, nothing. Noelle's hands clenched around the locket as she looked into Melinda's eyes. "I don't remember," she admitted, her voice raw. Melinda felt her heart ache. "That's okay," she said gently. "But Noelle, I believe you're Ava, my Ava." Noelle jolted as if struck. She shot up from her seat, her chair scraping against the floor. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's impossible. I don't have a mother." Melinda felt the sting of those words cut deep. "You do," she whispered. "You did." Noelle turned away, pacing, one hand pressed against her forehead. Her mind spun with 1,000 questions, her heart pounding so fast it hurt. This had to be a mistake. But deep inside, something stirred, something that had been buried for so long she barely recognized it. A whisper of something familiar. She turned back, her eyes dark with uncertainty. "If I was really your daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you find me?" Melinda felt the breath leave her lungs. The weight of 16 years of guilt came crashing down all at once. "I tried," she whispered. "I searched for you everywhere. The police, the media. I did everything I could." Her voice cracked. "But you were gone, Noelle. Just gone." Noelle's jaw clenched. She had no memories of someone searching for her. No foster families had ever mentioned it. All she had ever known was rejection. How could she believe this? "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Noelle asked, her voice hard now, almost accusing. Melinda hesitated for only a second before answering. "A DNA test." Noelle flinched, her body stiffening. Melinda reached into her bag and placed a small kit on the table. "This will prove it," she said, her voice steady. "If you agree, we'll know for sure." Noelle stared at the kit like it was some kind of ticking bomb. A part of her wanted to refuse, to walk away, to shove this entire conversation out of her mind. But another part wanted to know if she had really been wanted all this time. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and picked up the swab. Her hands trembled as she swiped it along the inside of her cheek, then silently handed it back to Melinda. Melinda exhaled, her fingers brushing against Noelle's for the briefest moment as she took the swab. "I'll have the results as soon as possible," Melinda promised. "And if I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone." Noelle scoffed. "You really think I'm your daughter, don't you?" Melinda's eyes glistened. "With everything in me." Noelle swallowed, her gaze darting toward the locket again. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt like a little girl again, lost, scared, and desperately wanting to believe in something good. But belief had never done anything for her before. So why should she start now? Melinda stood, preparing to leave. "Noelle," she hesitated. "No matter what the results say, I just want you to know that I never stopped loving Ava." Her voice broke. "Never." Noelle didn't reply. She only watched as Melinda turned and walked out of the room, her figure disappearing through the metal door. Silence settled in the air. Noelle looked down at the locket in her hands, and for the first time in years, she dared to wonder, what if it was true? What if, after all these years, she wasn't completely alone? She swallowed hard, gripping the necklace tighter. She didn't know the answer. But soon, she would. Shadows of the past. The dim glow of Melinda's office lamp cast long shadows over the stacks of legal documents and case files scattered across her desk. The DNA test results were due to arrive in less than 48 hours, but time felt like a slow, merciless crawl. Her heart was restless. If the test came back positive, and God, she prayed it would confirm what her heart already knew. Noelle was Ava, her Ava. But what then? 16 years had passed. Ava, or Noelle, had lived an entirely different life, one filled with struggles, loneliness, and loss. She wasn't the little girl Melinda had tucked into bed every night. She wasn't the giggling child who had danced barefoot in the backyard, chasing fireflies under the moonlight. She was someone else now, and Melinda didn't know if she would ever get her daughter back. The weight of that realization pressed heavy on her chest. A sharp knock on her office door broke through the fog of her thoughts. "Come in," she called, straightening in her chair. The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, his face unusually serious. "You have a visitor," he said, glancing behind him. Melinda frowned. "Who?" Charles hesitated before stepping aside. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was Noelle. Melinda's breath hitched. Noelle shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the strap of the worn-out backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her posture stiff, like she was ready to run at any moment. Noelle cleared her throat. "I wasn't sure if I should come." Melinda stood slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might startle her away. "I'm glad you did." Noelle scoffed but stepped inside, Charles giving them privacy as he closed the door behind her. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Noelle finally sighed and dropped into the chair across from Melinda's desk. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted, rubbing her temples. "This whole thing is messing with my head." Melinda sat down as well, trying to keep her hands from trembling. "I can't imagine what you must be feeling." Noelle let out a bitter laugh. "You can't imagine. My whole life, I've been told I don't belong anywhere. And now suddenly, I might have this whole past that I don't even remember." She exhaled sharply. "It's too much." Melinda's throat tightened. Noelle glanced at her, expression unreadable. "You really think I'm her, don't you?" Melinda reached for the locket still on her desk, holding it gently. "I know you are." Noelle looked away. "And if the test proves I'm not?" Melinda swallowed. "Then I'll still care." Noelle's eyes flickered with something Melinda couldn't quite place. Doubt? Hope? She shook her head. "I don't know what I expect from this." "What do you want, Noelle?" The question hung in the air. Noelle shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softer now. "But I figured I'd hear what you had to say." Melinda hesitated, then reached into her desk drawer. She pulled out a worn manila folder, its edges frayed from years of handling. "I never stopped looking for you," she said, sliding the folder across the desk. Noelle eyed it warily before opening it. Inside were newspaper clippings, missing person flyers, police reports. Every piece of evidence from Ava Carter's disappearance 16 years ago. Noelle's breath caught as she flipped through them. There were pictures of a little girl, her hair in soft curls, her eyes bright and full of life. A little girl who looked just like her. Her fingers trembled as she traced one of the photographs. "This is me." Melinda nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes." Noelle swallowed hard. "I don't remember any of this." Melinda reached forward, resting her hand on the table but careful not to touch Noelle. "That's okay," she said softly. "Memories can be buried, especially if something traumatic happened." Noelle stiffened. "Like what?" Melinda exhaled. "That's what I want to find out." Noelle clenched her jaw, her mind spinning. What if she had been taken? What if something had happened to her that she couldn't remember? The thought sent a chill down her spine. Melinda's voice softened. "Will you let me help you find the truth?" Noelle hesitated. She had spent her entire life believing she was unwanted, that she had been left behind. But what if that wasn't the case? What if someone had been looking for her all this time? She glanced at the photo in her hands again. The little girl with the bright eyes and innocent smile felt like a stranger. But somehow, she felt like home. Noelle swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I want to know," she whispered. Melinda's chest ached with overwhelming emotion, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Then we'll find out together." A long silence stretched between them before Noelle cleared her throat. I don't really have a place to stay tonight, she admitted awkwardly. Melinda's heart clenched. You can stay with me. Noel's eyes widened slightly. Are you sure? Melinda smiled. I've been waiting 16 years to have you home. Noel hesitated but eventually nodded. Okay, she said quietly. But just for tonight. Melinda knew better than to push. She would take whatever time Noel was willing to give. As they left the office together, walking side by side for the first time, Melinda felt something stir deep within her. Hope. It wasn't just about DNA results anymore. It was about the chance to finally heal. For both of them. Fragments of the forgotten. Noel sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Melinda's car, her hands resting awkwardly in her lap. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. Outside, the city passed by in a blur. Neon signs, streetlights flickering in the dark, the endless movement of people who had no idea that inside this car, two strangers were bound by a past neither of them fully understood, or at least Noel didn't. Melinda had spent 16 years drowning in that past, but for Noel, it was a blank space, a void where memories should have been. She stared down at the locket in her hands, running her thumb over the engraving on the back. Forever my Eve. The name still felt foreign, like a ghost of someone she should know but didn't. Could this really be her? Was she really the daughter of this woman? The woman who had looked at her in that holding cell with more emotion than anyone had ever looked at her before. She clenched her jaw, shoving the thoughts aside. She didn't have answers, just a storm of confusion swirling inside her. Melinda's voice broke the silence. You hungry? Noel blinked, glancing at her. Ha. Melinda offered a small smile. It's late, but there's a diner near my house. We can grab something to eat if you want. Noel hesitated. She wasn't used to people offering things without expecting something in return. But something about Melinda's expression, hopeful, yet careful, like she was afraid of pushing too hard, made her nod. Yeah, Noel muttered. I guess. A late-night meal and unspoken truths. The diner was nearly empty when they walked in, the scent of coffee and fried food thick in the air. The neon OPN 24 Allure sign flickered against the window, casting a dull glow inside. A waitress led them to a booth near the back, and Noel slid into the seat across from Melinda, feeling strangely exposed. She was used to eating alone, or more often, not eating at all. Melinda picked up the menu, scanning it with the ease of someone who had probably eaten here dozens of times. The pancakes are good here. And the grilled cheese. Noel shrugged. I'll just get whatever. Melinda paused, then set the menu down. Noel, when's the last time you had a decent meal? Noel frowned. I eat. Melinda's gaze didn't waver. That's not what I asked. Noel looked away, hating the way her throat tightened. Don't do that, she muttered. Do what? Look at me like that. Like I'm some lost puppy or something. Melinda sighed, but there was no pity in her eyes, just something softer, something Noel didn't know how to deal with. I don't see you as a lost puppy, Melinda said gently. I see you as my daughter. Noel tensed. That word. Daughter. She didn't know how to wear it. Didn't know if she wanted to. The waitress appeared before she had to answer, taking their orders. Noel barely glanced at the menu before muttering. Grilled cheese is fine. Melinda ordered the same, plus a coffee. When they were alone again, Melinda leaned forward, her voice careful. Noel, can I ask you something? Noel exhaled. I guess. What do you remember? The question sent an icy shiver down Noel's spine. She fidgeted with the napkin in front of her. Not much, she admitted. Nothing before I was 5. No flashes, no faces. Noel hesitated. There were pieces. A woman's laughter. The feeling of warm arms around her. A backyard with a tree swing. The scent of vanilla. But those weren't memories. Not really. just feelings that didn't belong anywhere. So she shook her head. Nothing real. Melinda's expression remained calm, but Noelle saw the way her hands clenched on the table, the way her throat moved as she swallowed hard. It was strange, seeing someone care so much about a past Noelle barely knew existed. The food arrived, and they fell into silence as Noelle took small bites of her sandwich, her appetite wavering under the weight of the conversation. Melinda, however, barely touched hers. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph, sliding it across the table. Noelle hesitated before picking it up. The girl in the picture couldn't have been older than 6. She had big, bright brown eyes, dimples in her cheeks, and a mischievous grin. She was sitting on the lap of a woman, her mother. Melinda, a much younger version of her, laughing as she held the little girl close. Noelle's stomach twisted. "That's the last picture we ever took together," Melinda said quietly. "2 weeks before you disappeared." Noelle swallowed, tracing the edge of the photo with her thumb. It felt familiar, but also wrong, like looking at someone else's life. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Melinda sighed. "You don't have to say anything." Noelle hesitated, then set the picture down. After a moment, she asked, "If I really was Ava," she said slowly, testing the name on her tongue. "How did I disappear?" Melinda inhaled deeply, as if bracing herself. "That's the part I don't know," she said. "One day, you were playing in the backyard. The next, you were gone. No witnesses, no leads. Just gone." Noelle's fingers tightened around the napkin. Gone. Like she had just vanished. Noelle wasn't sure why, but her chest ached at the thought. Melinda rubbed her temples. The police said it was an abduction, but there was never a ransom. No demands. Just silence. Noelle shivered. "Someone took me," she whispered. Melinda's jaw clenched, "and I never stopped looking for you." Noelle looked down at the locket still clutched in her hand. Somewhere, deep inside, something clicked. A piece of her had always felt missing. Maybe this was why. Melinda cleared her throat. "We should head home." Noelle blinked. Home. That word felt even stranger than daughter. But for some reason, she didn't say no. A house full of ghosts. Melinda's house was nothing like the places Noelle had grown up in. It was warm, with soft lighting, bookshelves lining the walls, and the scent of something vaguely floral lingering in the air. For a moment, Noelle just stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sheer normalcy of it. "Come in," Melinda said, setting down her purse. "You can stay in the guest room." Noelle nodded stiffly, stepping inside. Everywhere she looked, there were traces of a life she didn't remember. Framed photos, a piano, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. She swallowed hard. "This is weird," she muttered. Melinda smiled gently. "I know." Noelle exhaled, shifting her bag on her shoulder. I'm just gonna go to bed." Melinda hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." As Noelle disappeared down the hall, Melinda pressed a hand over her heart. She had her daughter in her house again, but she wasn't sure if she would ever really get her back. And tomorrow, the DNA results would come in, and they would know the truth. A house full of ghosts. Noelle stood in the doorway of the guest room, gripping the strap of her backpack. She had been in dozens of temporary homes over the years, cold foster houses, overcrowded shelters, run-down apartments, but this one was different. It wasn't just a house. It was hers, apparently, or at least, it had been. The walls were painted a soft blue, the kind of color that felt soothing, familiar. A bookshelf stood against one side, empty, but there was dust on the shelves, like books had once lived there. A window overlooked a backyard, where a large oak tree stood tall against the night sky. Something about that tree made Noelle pause. She knew that tree. A flicker of something, an image, a feeling, tugged at the edges of her mind. A girl laughing, swinging from a tire hanging from one of its thick branches. A warm breeze, someone pushing her higher. She squeezed her eyes shut. No, she wouldn't do this. She wouldn't let herself get sucked in. This house, this life, it wasn't hers. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Noelle exhaled sharply and set her bag down on the floor before sitting at the edge of the bed. The mattress was softer than anything she'd slept on in years. Too soft. It made her uneasy, like she wasn't supposed to be here. She glanced at the locket still clutched in her hand. Forever, my Ava. The words felt heavier than ever. She had spent years not knowing where she belonged. Now, for the first time, she might have an answer. But the truth terrified her, because what if it was real? What if she had a mother, one who had been searching for her all this time? And worse, what if she lost it all over again? Noelle sucked in a breath and curled up on the bed, pulling the blanket over herself. She had survived this long on her own. She could survive this, too. Right? Melinda's restless night. Down the hall, Melinda sat in her dimly lit study, staring at the phone on her desk. The DNA test results were coming in the morning. Less than 12 hours. She should have been relieved. But she was terrified. What if she was wrong? What if Noelle wasn't Ava? Could she handle losing her daughter all over again? She ran a shaking hand through her hair. For 16 years, she had dreamed of this moment, of finding Ava, of bringing her home, of holding her again, and never letting go. And now she was just a few hours away from knowing the truth. Her heart ached. She stood, moving to the bookshelf where framed photographs lined the shelves. She picked up one. The same picture she had shown Noelle earlier at the diner. Ava, only 6 years old, grinning up at her with that dimpled smile. She traced the edges of the photo, her vision blurring. "I've got you back," she whispered. But did she? Did she really? A nightmare from the past. Noelle's dreams were restless. Shadows stretched long and twisted in the corners of her mind. Whispers drifted through the darkness. Voices she didn't recognize, but somehow she knew them. A woman's laughter. A backyard. The creak of a swing. Then, a hand grabbing her wrist. A voice, low and menacing. "You don't belong here." Her chest tightened. The air turned thick, suffocating. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then suddenly, a sharp, blinding light. Noelle gasped, jerking upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She looked around wildly, trying to ground herself. The room. The soft blue walls. The bookshelf. Melinda's house. Not a foster home. Not a shelter. She was here. But the dream. The nightmare. It had felt so real. Noelle reached for the locket around her neck, gripping it tightly. A memory. Or just a trick of her mind. She didn't know. But something deep inside her whispered, "You've been running from the truth for a long time." And maybe, just maybe, it was finally catching up to her. The DNA results arrive. Morning came too quickly. Noelle barely slept. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her hands resting between her knees, her stomach twisted with something she didn't want to name. Fear, hope, doubt, all of it tangled together into something that made her feel like she couldn't breathe. A soft knock on the door made her jolt. "Noelle." Melinda's voice. She swallowed hard. "Yeah." The door opened slowly, and Melinda stepped inside. Her face was unreadable, but in her hand she held an envelope. Noelle's throat went dry. "This is it," Melinda said softly. Noelle nodded slowly. "Yeah." Melinda hesitated. "Do you want me to open it, or do you?" "You do it." Noelle cut in, voice tight. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to see the truth for herself. Melinda nodded. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal on the envelope. The paper inside rustled as she unfolded it. Noelle clenched her fists. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a sharp inhale. Melinda's fingers tightened around the paper. Tears welled in her eyes. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Noelle felt the world tilt. "What?" she whispered. Melinda looked up, her voice shaking. "It's you," she choked out. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "You're my daughter." Noelle's breath caught. The room spun. She felt like she was floating, like the floor had been ripped out from under her. She had spent years searching for something, for anything that made her feel like she belonged. And now here it was. But she didn't know what to do with it. She didn't know how to be someone's daughter. So instead of saying anything, she just sat there, staring, as Melinda let out a soft, broken sob. 16 years. 16 years of pain. 16 years of loss. And now, in one moment, the truth was laid bare. Noelle was Ava Carter. She had always been. She just hadn't known it. Melinda stepped forward, as if afraid Noelle might disappear again. "Noelle," she whispered, voice shaking. "Please say something." Noelle opened her mouth, but no words came. She was drowning. Drowning in a truth she had never been prepared to find. And the scariest part, she didn't know if she wanted to be saved. The truth that hurts. The room was suffocating. The DNA test results lay open on the bed, stark black letters spelling out the undeniable truth. 99.99% match. Noelle Bennett was Ava Carter. For 16 years, she had lived under a different name, in a different life, believing she had no family, no history to claim. But now, everything had changed. Melinda stood across from her, the paper still trembling in her hands, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. Noelle had never seen someone cry like that before, not out of pain, not out of anger, but out of something else. Something deeper. Grief. Relief. Love. The kind of love Noelle had never let herself believe was real. She should have felt something. Joy. Peace. But instead, all she felt was fear. She had spent so long defining herself as the girl who had nothing, who belonged to no one. And now, in one single moment, she had a mother again. A home. A name. And it terrified her. "Noelle," Melinda began, stepping forward, reaching for her. Noelle flinched. She flinched. Melinda froze, hurt flickering across her face, but she quickly masked it. Noelle felt her stomach twist. I need air," she muttered, pushing off the bed and grabbing her backpack. "Noelle, wait." But she was already moving, her legs carrying her out of the room, out of the house, into the sharp, biting morning air. She sucked in a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her chest felt too tight, like the weight of the truth was pressing down on her lungs. This was real. Too real, and she wasn't ready for it. Running from home. The streets were quiet as Noelle walked aimlessly, the sun barely risen over the horizon. Her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack, knuckles white. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed away. Away from that house. Away from the truth. Away from her. Melinda. Her mother. Noelle swallowed hard, trying to push back the panic clawing at her throat. She had spent years training herself to survive, to shut people out, to never get attached. And now she was supposed to be someone's daughter. She didn't know how to be that. She had no idea how to let someone care about her. She had spent too long believing she didn't deserve it. A familiar ache settled in her chest, the same one that always whispered, "You don't belong anywhere." Noelle clenched her jaw. Maybe that was still true. Memories in pieces. Hours passed before Noelle realized she had wandered into an old neighborhood, one she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Her feet led her to a small playground, tucked between two rows of houses. She hesitated at the entrance, staring at the rusted swing set, the faded slide, the overgrown grass. Something about this place pulled at her. She stepped forward slowly, her heart pounding harder with every step. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the swing chain, and suddenly, a flash of something. Laughter. A child's giggle. The feeling of wind rushing past her as someone pushed her higher and higher. Higher, Mommy. Higher. Noelle gasped, stumbling back, her breath hitching. Her hands flew to her head, gripping at her hair as the memory flickered, hazy and incomplete. It was real. Not just a dream. Not just a trick of her mind. A memory. She had been here before. This had been her playground. This had been her life. She staggered back, her legs weak beneath her, the realization hitting her like a freight train. It was true. All of it. She was Ava Carter, and she had been taken from this life. Her head spun as more fragments of memories clawed their way to the surface. A warm embrace. A woman's voice singing softly. A night filled with sirens. Hands grabbing her. Fear. Then, nothing. Darkness. Noelle's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away from the playground, her heart hammering wildly. She had to get out of here. She had to go. Melinda's desperate search. Melinda paced her living room, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Noelle was gone. Again. She had woken up to an empty house, her heart dropping to her stomach when she realized the guest room door was open, the bed cold and untouched. She had called Charles, called the police, called everyone, but no one had seen Noelle. Panic swelled in her chest. She couldn't lose her again. She wouldn't. After an hour of searching, she finally grabbed her coat and keys, heading out into the city. And then, by some miracle, she found her. Noelle was sitting on a bus stop bench, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself. Melinda pulled up to the curb and jumped out of the car. Noelle. Noelle's head snapped up, her eyes wide, but she didn't move. Melinda rushed toward her, her heart racing. Noelle, she breathed, stopping just short of her. Are you okay? Noelle swallowed hard, looking away. I don't know. Melinda exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. You scared me. Noelle let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, I have that effect on people. Melinda frowned. That's not what I meant. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, I remembered something, Noelle murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Melinda's breath caught. What? Noelle shifted, hugging herself tighter. A playground. A swing. You pushing me. Melinda's eyes welled with tears. That was your favorite place, she whispered. You used to beg me to push you higher. You loved it so much. Noelle swallowed. It felt real. It was real, Melinda said softly. Noelle hesitated, then looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, Melinda saw it. The wall starting to crack. The fear still there, but now, mixed with something else. Something like hope. I don't know how to do this, Noelle admitted, her voice shaky. Melinda took a slow step forward. You don't have to know, she said. We'll figure it out. Together. Noelle's throat tightened. She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But after years of being let down, of being left behind, could she really trust this? Could she trust her? Melinda took another step forward, close enough now that she could reach out if she wanted to. If you let me, Melinda said gently, I will never stop fighting for you. You don't have to run anymore. Noelle's fingers curled around the locket at her neck. Maybe, just maybe, she was tired of running. Learning to stay. A silent ride home. Noelle sat in the passenger seat of Melinda's car again, but this time, it felt different. The air was thick with something neither of them had the words for. Acceptance, fear, hope. Noelle wasn't sure. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. As the car rolled through the quiet streets, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, Melinda stole glances at her, as if afraid that if she looked away for too long, Noelle would disappear again. Noelle felt the weight of those glances. She wasn't used to being seen. For most of her life, she had been invisible, a name on a case file, a girl moving from shelter to shelter, a shadow in the background of someone else's story. But now someone had found her, and she didn't know what to do with that. Melinda cleared her throat. "Are you hungry?" Noelle shook her head. Melinda nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Noelle could tell she was holding back, wanting to ask 1,000 questions, but not wanting to push too hard. The patience in that made Noelle's stomach twist. Nobody had ever been patient with her before. Nobody had ever waited for her to be ready. As they pulled into the driveway, Noelle hesitated before getting out. "This is weird," she muttered. Melinda smiled faintly. "Yeah, it is." Noelle exhaled and followed her inside. This time, when the door closed behind them, she didn't feel trapped. She felt safe. She wasn't sure how to deal with that either. A room full of memories. Melinda led her down the hallway again, past the guest room. But this time, she stopped at a different door. She hesitated, glancing at Noelle. I never changed it." Noelle frowned. "Changed what?" Melinda swallowed, then slowly pushed open the door, and Noelle's breath caught. The room was small, but it felt full. Full of a life she didn't remember. A twin-sized bed sat against the far wall, the quilt neatly tucked in, like it had been waiting for someone to come home. A dusty old dollhouse sat on a shelf, surrounded by stuffed animals that had long since been forgotten. The walls were painted in soft lavender, little glow-in-the-dark stars tucked to the ceiling, now faded with time. Noelle took a slow step inside. It was like stepping into someone else's childhood. Her fingers trailed over the edge of a small desk, its surface scratched from years of use. A row of books lined the shelf above it, titles she didn't recognize, but something about them felt right. She turned, her voice quiet. "This was mine." Melinda nodded, her eyes shimmering. "Yes." Noelle swallowed hard. She had spent years moving from place to place, never feeling like she belonged anywhere. But here, in this little room, she belonged. Even if she didn't remember it, she had been someone here. And that scared her more than anything. Because if she let herself believe this was real, if she let herself believe that she had a family, that she was loved, then she had to admit that something had stolen that from her, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face that yet. She turned away from the room, blinking rapidly. I should sleep." Melinda nodded quickly. "Of course. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to." Noelle hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she shook her head. "No, I think I want to." Melinda's breath hitched, but she didn't say anything. She only nodded, stepping back. "Good night, sweetheart." Noelle stiffened. She hadn't been called that in years. And yet, she didn't hate the way it sounded. She didn't hate the way it felt. She slipped inside the room, closing the door behind her, and for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting to leave. She felt like she was learning to stay. The ghosts of a stolen past. Noelle barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes of memories teased at the edge of her mind. The scent of vanilla, the feel of warm arms around her, a backyard with a swing. And then, the dark, the fear, a hand grabbing her wrist. Noelle gasped, bolting upright, her breath coming fast. Her hands were shaking, her heart pounding. She clenched the bedsheets, willing the fear away, but the image of that hand, of someone taking her, it felt real. More real than anything else had in years. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a hand to her forehead. What had happened to her? What had stolen those years away? And why was she so afraid to remember? Breakfast and breaking walls. By the time morning came, Noelle had barely slept, but she still wandered out of the bedroom. drawn by the scent of coffee and something warm. She hesitated at the edge of the kitchen, watching as Melinda moved around, flipping pancakes on a pan, 2 plates already set on the table. "You cook," Noel muttered. Melinda turned, startled. Then she smiled. "I used to." Noel arched a brow. "This for me?" Melinda's expression softened. "Of course." Noel hesitated. No one had ever made her breakfast before. Not just because they had to, but because they wanted to. She slid into the chair slowly, eyeing the stack of pancakes. Melinda sat across from her, waiting. After a long moment, Noel picked up her fork and took a bite. It was warm, sweet. It tasted like home. And that scared her more than anything, because it meant she had something to lose. Melinda watched her carefully. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "But I want you to." Noel swallowed hard. She looked down at her plate, her fingers tightening around the fork. She had spent her entire life believing she wasn't worth staying for. But here, in this kitchen, with pancakes and soft morning light, and a woman who had never given up on her, maybe she could believe, just for a little while, that she was. She took another bite, nodding slowly. "I think," she said quietly, "I think I want to stay. For now." Melinda's eyes filled with emotion, but she didn't push. She only smiled. "That's all I could ever ask for." Noel exhaled, her heart still unsteady, still unsure. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. And that was enough. For now.